Good afternoon. Could everybody hear me now? Good, excellent. It's very good to see such a packed room for this session on gender equality. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. My name is Joanna. I'm the Special Envoy for Gender Equality from the UK. And I'm delighted to be moderating this session entitled She Leads in the Alpha Century, the New Narratives of Transformation and Change. And specifically, we'll explore how women are steadily taking their place in positions of power around the world. Now, there's a great deal of talk at the moment about strongman politics at the moment, and I know we'll certainly be touching on that in the course of the session. And against this backdrop of uncertainty and muscular politics, this panel will bring out, I hope, how female leadership, or indeed greater parity at senior levels, can bring about vision, stability, and transformation. And it's apt that we're here talking about female leadership now, not just to aspire to that 2020 vision that we all look for. This is the year, of course, where we celebrate 25 years since the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action on Women and Girls, and 20 years since the very first UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, acknowledging the disproportionate impact that conflict has on women and girls around the world, but also the role that women can play in securing long-lasting peace as mediators, as negotiators, and as peacekeepers. We see more women than ever before in playing leading roles in politics, in governments, in business, media, law, all of the professions. Times are changing, but not fast enough. 130 million girls around the world are still not able to get a good quality education. And there are concerted efforts to roll back some of those freedoms and rights. But elsewhere, there is a growing recognition that when women are brought in, everyone benefits, women and men and boys and girls. Now, I'm joined this afternoon by 5 phenomenal women, making this one of the most illustrious panels I have ever joined in, I have to say. First, to my right, Minister Irani, the Minister for Women and Child Development here in India. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Minister. You're the youngest minister in this government, I understand, and named by the World Economic Forum in 2015 as a young global leader. Thank you very much indeed. Sitting next to her doesn't really need any introduction, but former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark. 9 years, yes, absolutely. 9 years as Prime Minister, serving 3 successive terms from 1999 to 2008. Under your leadership, the New Zealand economy thrived, but you also focused on creating an inclusive society too, proving that two are most definitely not mutually exclusive. And we look forward to hearing more from you about how you achieved this and the role that women can play in delivering policy outcomes. Next, Dr. Brimmer, Dr. Esther Brimmer, the Executive Director and CEO of the NAFSA Association of International Educators from the United States. Thank you also for joining us. Your career has taken in 3 stints at the US Department of State, mainly on multilateral work. You've taught at some of the world's most prestigious universities, including Johns Hopkins and the College of Europe. You gained your doctorate at Oxford, and you've also worked for McKinsey. Thank you for joining us. Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis is the 50th Lieutenant Governor of California and the first woman elected to this position. You took this up in January 2019. Thank you for joining us too. You also served under President Barack Obama as the US Ambassador to Hungary. You wrote a book about this. I won't say any more, but I'm sure we'll hear more about this in the course of the session. Thank you also for joining us. And at the end, but no least, Baroness Patricia Scotland, QC, and Secretary General of the Commonwealth from Dominica, also based in London. Thank you too for joining us. You became a member of the House of Lords in 1997, and amongst many other accolades, you are as the UK current chair in office of the Commonwealth. We're seeing a lot of each other as you strive towards women empowerment in the Commonwealth. Thank you too. So let's get cracking. I'm going to start by asking the panel about political leadership. I'll start with former Prime Minister Clark. In your experience, what was it for you that made a difference as a female Prime Minister, and what do you think women specifically can bring to the challenges of political leadership?
Well, firstly, I think in principle, it's right that women should, around half the time, be occupying the top positions. I think the very powerful signalling that sends to girls and women throughout our societies is that no door is closed. Now, the reality is a lot of the doors are closed at the moment. My own country, for 13 of the last 22 years, has had women prime ministers, and we now have our third, which obviously is a matter of great pride. But we're quite unusual in that. We're a small society, which didn't make it necessarily that easy for me to come to the top. But the fact that two of us came to the top before Jacinda made it possible for a 37-year-old woman to become Prime Minister of our country. So a lot of it is about seeing is believing, seeing women in these positions, women who, by the way, usually had to claw their way up the ladder to get there. It isn't easy, but you establish that precedent and more can then follow after you. Now, I don't want to idealize women in leadership because, there's good women leaders and not so good women leaders, just as the same applies to men. But in general, I believe that women are more likely to be inclusive in their style, to be more consultative. That, by the way, doesn't mean you should be, riddled with indecision and be paralyzed by not being able to make a decision. But having that capacity to include, to listen, to make a decision, to act on it, to move on. Women demonstrably in top positions have proven that they can do that. But overall, I think it matters that women are well represented at the top tables because women's perspectives are needed. If women's perspectives aren't at the table, we won't make optimal decisions. And if you take that into a commercial environment, the research does show that the companies which have the significant numbers of women on their boards and in their senior management actually do better. They're more profitable. And I often say, why would we be surprised? Because those managements and those boards are attuned to the needs of women as consumers. So it matters. And the same applies to political decision making. If you're making decisions about the other who isn't sitting at the table, they're not going to be very good decisions. So there's so many reasons for advocating that women should be at the top table, and one can always quote Hillary Clinton, who said it's not just gender equality isn't just the right thing to do, it's a smart thing to do, and the societies that embrace it will definitely be the stronger for it, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to pass now to Lieutenant Governor. I'm really interested in your experiences at sort of state level, but also your experiences working in Hungary, where I imagine that was quite an interesting environment to be operating. Over to you.
Sure. So when I think about those two jobs, there were many things that were different. But in terms of being a woman in an appointed position, your power is derived from the authority that put you there. So when I sat in a meeting, I had the United States of America on a little tent in front of me. I knew who I represented, and I was given the job by the president. It's different when you run for office, because in that case, your power is derived from, in California, for statewide office, as it turned out, 5.8 million people marking a little dot next to your name. And it's a very different thing to have the confidence of people, but more than that, to inspire them to choose you as someone who they see as a leader. And one of the things that we talk a lot about in this space is unconscious bias, and the way that people see women versus men in terms of what they conceptualize as a leader who builds confidence. When I was, in the middle of the night on an airplane in the middle of my campaign, and I sat next to a woman, and I think my clothes were disheveled and wrinkled, my ponytail had gone sideways, and she said, well, what's it like as a woman running for office? And I said, well, who were you supporting for the governor? And she said, Gavin Newsom, who ended up winning. And I said, well, who does Gavin Newsom remind you of? And she said, oh, kind of a young John F. Kennedy, a little bit of a Clinton. And I said, okay, well, who do I remind you of? And there was nothing. There was no parallel. And I think that what happened in 2018, which definitely will go down in the history books as a year of the woman in the United States, was this movement that started with the Women's March, the single largest day demonstration in the history of the world, really led to women standing up, fear melting away, not thinking that you had to look like a candidate from central casting, but just looking like you and going out and sharing your ideas. And people were extremely motivated to find women on the ballot and vote for them. And so across the United States, we now have record numbers of women in the Congress, and Nancy Pelosi was given the gavel back to be the speaker. I was definitely a beneficiary of that. I'd never run for office before, and I was elected to be the first woman in this position. And so now what we have that's very encouraging is this whole new crop of women who've been elected, but none of us look like each other. And there's really no stereotype that puts people in a box. And just one more point on this, again, in trends in the United States, because I think they're going to bear out. What we picked up in our polling and this trend that I think is very important is that the greatest champions of women leadership when it comes to elective trends in the United States is women of color supporting other women to be in elected office. And they have really emerged as the champions, whether they have done it consciously or not, the numbers bear this out. And so I think that's good news as well.
Thank you very much. And both of you talked about this concept of what a leader looks like and the unconscious bias. And, for many of us, looking ahead to women who have been at the vanguard or really, sort of cracked that ceiling is so important, because only then can you create a pipeline coming behind you. I want to come back to this point a little bit later on in the panel. I'm going to ask Secretary General Scotland, Baroness Scotland, you have the vantage point of looking over sort of 53 countries over the Commonwealth. What have been your observations from that, or any other of your experience?
Well, I think one of the extraordinary things that have happened in the Commonwealth is we represent 5 different regions, there are 53 countries, 2.4 billion people, and we have really needed to see women's leadership coming to the fore. And the question is, how can that happen in the plethora of different countries who have different histories, different approaches? And so we in the Commonwealth have really concentrated on thinking about how can we bring women forward. And so when I've been talking to various countries as to why they have succeeded in doing that, many of the things that the last 2 speakers, Helen and others, have spoken about have come. They say, women listen. But the women don't just listen, they hear you. And that's a really important distinction. Women are efficient, they're effective, and in fact, many of the prime ministers and presidents I've spoken to, and I've said to them, why have you appointed female ministers? They've said because they get the job done. They don't talk, they do. So I think this is a really powerful feature of how women operate. And if you look at one of the most successful countries who've actually delivered that, it's Rwanda. Rwanda now has 63.8% of their parliament is female, and more than 38% in the upper house is female, but they have just tipped over more than 50% of their cabinet is now female. And they are one of the fastest growing, most effective countries economically. So what we are seeing is that if you are smart, and I think Helen talked about being smart, you have to utilize all of your talent and understand that talent comes in many shapes, many sizes, and it doesn't have to look like you. And I think if you just look at this panel, we are all very different, save for one factor, and that is we share the same gender. But I can tell you from my own experience that I never looked like anybody else. When I first became a barrister at 21, there was only 7% of the bar were female, and 0.1% of the bar were black female. I was the first person to take silk in our country to become a Queen's Counsel, the first High Court judge, the first woman to be Secretary General. And what's really important is what you've just said. We have to have someone to have gone before us. And most of us loved the fact that there was a Helen Clark. She was magnificent. She is magnificent. And therefore, there are people to aspire to. So all the women on this panel have probably broken a number of ceilings. And I think it's quintessentially important to all the women, young women coming after us, that those ceilings continue to be broken. So we need men to champion us, because many of the women who have succeeded because they have had male champions. And so I think it's those women and friends. And so for the men out there, find a brilliant woman, champion her, she'll save your bacon.
There you go, you heard that here first. I'd like to turn now to the Minister. You've heard what some of the other panel have said, how women get the job done. You have a big portfolio, and I know from speaking to some of your officials that you have a huge programme underway supporting women's empowerment here in India. What's been your experience as a Minister?
I think that while we are looking at women in politics from a political office point of view, much also should be said about how women are looked upon now as vote banks. And I don't mean it in a deprecating way. I think that this is one of the positive changes that had happened. Because for years on end, we've had policies and governments across the world who have pursued agendas for empowering women. But we've seen a tectonic shift across the world, where now there are banks of women who say that if your policy measures up to my expectations, you can count on my vote. And I think that that has been one of the biggest changes in politics across the world. I applaud that because I think that that brings a measure of power in the hand of the female electorate, in the hand of the female voter. So the uprising as such of the female voter across the world is a cause for celebration for many of us. Because for me, I have seen across governments in my country, for the first time, a Prime Minister has prioritized female-led development. So for us to go from women's development to a nation or an economy to be led by women, I think that whole change is, from an administrative point of view, from a psychological point of view, and from a socio-political point of view, a huge change, which we are seeing led by a man. So while the Baroness speaks about finding a male champion, I think apart from the individual female who seeks a champion, though I would disagree a little bit, because I think that as women for too long, we have shared our success. While a man very proudly says, I have succeeded because I am me and I'm talented, it's always the women who says, I have succeeded because I've had other champions. So I think that there is a segment of women who succeed because they are talented and they are not in need of a champion, and they are excellent examples in themselves. And I also feel that the female electorate getting empowered because she will vote only if you deliver on promises of development is again a very positive change across the world.
Thank you very much indeed. And of course, we can all be champions for women ourselves as well.
No, absolutely. In fact, I would like to take this opportunity. It is my first ever on a platform, including Raisina Dialogues, where I've seen a hall filled with people, and the men same in number in terms of presence as women. So I think that is one of the fundamental changes that I'm seeing. That on women's issues, it's not only the women who lead the agenda or discuss or deliberate. Men are now equal partners, and I think that gives you cause for celebration.
Absolutely. Men as allies and champions as much as women. I'd like to turn the topic a little bit towards security and sort of conflict resolution. I'd like to bring in Dr. Brimmer. And I know that as well as your stint at State Department doing sort of multilateral work, then you've also worked at the Carnegie Commission on preventing deadly conflict. Now, there is so much data out there that we know that when women get involved in peace processes, they're about 65% less likely to fail, over 30% more likely to last 15 years or more. And yet, only 2% mediators, 8% negotiators, 5% of witnesses to peace processes. What is it? Why is this happening? Well, we can all guess the reasons why, but what has been your experience in this?
Great. But first, thank you for the question. And I'd also like to begin by thanking ORF and all of the hosts for the wonderful, stimulating conversation here at the Raisina Dialogues and the opportunity to be talking about these issues at this venue. And I will take up these questions on women, peace, and security. As you've indicated, one of the important things that's happened once women become decision makers is they set the agenda. They're able to redefine what we think constitutes international peace and security. One of the best examples has been the development since the year 2000 that began with Resolution 1325, but has continued spelling out how the impact of violence on women, but also women as peacemakers, actually as part of the solution. And indeed, as indicated, that in many complex situations, you need all of the population to be part of finding those solutions for zones of conflict. And one of the things that these resolutions have done is put women into crucial positions as part of building peace in societies. But it's not only classic women as peacemakers at the table in their immediate environment. But one of the most powerful images is actually a woman in uniform providing security, military security. And since we're here in New Delhi, I'd particularly like to call attention to the women as United Nations peacekeepers, and indeed the uniformed police unit from India. And indeed, there have been multiple deployments of Indian women who have been peacekeepers, particularly providing police, which has been important both from the peacekeeping side, but for many of the societies that received these outstanding women in uniform, recognizing that women are capable of performing all of the responsibilities of peace and security is very, very powerful. And I'll say personally that at two different stages in my life had the opportunity to accompany two of our female secretaries of state to the Security Council, and it was quite powerful to sit behind Secretary Clinton for the passage of Resolution 1888, and to have happily the United States in the chair of the Security Council passing a measure that advanced peace and security. So it's very powerful. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And if I may abuse my position as moderator, I mean, the whole women, peace and security agenda is really important for the UK as well. We launched a women mediators in the Commonwealth. We're trying to get more women mediators into those exact processes that you're talking about. And of course, this is the year where I think we'll see lots more really shifting the language from those Security Council resolutions into implementation. So plenty to do and plenty to look forward to. So thank you for that. I want to go back a little bit to the point around visibility and role models, what a leader looks like, and the power of interventions, the power of parity, if you like, and how we can all support the people coming behind us. As former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright says, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help women, and I'm sure we can all sort of relate to that. Can I go back to you, Dr. Brimmer, about how, whether it's women in uniform, women in diplomacy, what is it, do you think, that, women can be sort of made to be taken seriously?
Indeed, as the panelists have already talked about, that indeed that because of their training, it's not a biological argument, it's because of many of the experiences the women have had, they are often used to working by building consensus, listening and trying to make sure that maybe everybody is able to have successful conclusion. Skills that are very important in multilateral diplomacy. I would suggest many of our most difficult issues are transnational issues that require complex thinking and the ability to manage many different interests. And I would suggest that having more women around the diplomatic table has really advanced multilateral diplomacy and the ability to address these types of issues. I would also suggest that this is particularly important as we look at the issues that we'll face in the 21st century. This conference is looking out towards the coming century. And indeed, I would suggest that we want to be sure we're using all of the talent that we have to address those issues. There's been an important development over the past several decades. When we look just at the pipeline for leadership, that if we look at that segment of the global population that goes to higher education, that goes to university, now the majority of people in university in more than 100 countries are women. That at the undergraduate level in over 100 countries, there are more women than men going to university. This means that and that includes the United States, this means we actually have a pipeline of talent. Now, at the graduate level, we're seeing more men than women, but it means there are smart women in many societies who are getting the skills they need to be leaders. And I'll note particularly that when I look at the role not only of higher education, but international education, more and more women are traveling to other countries to get the best opportunities for education. I know we in the United States benefit from the fact that we have over 1 million international students in the United States, many of them from this part of the world. As you know, China and India are the two largest senders of students to the United States. And remarkably, there are many women who are in the STEM fields. And what's exciting is we're seeing women in STEM who are focusing on engineering and information technology, areas which are very important, are going to have jobs in the future. So there are smart people out there getting the right credentials, but we've got to be sure that they are not roadblocks, that they have models to look up to so that they can be part of leading in the next century.
Thank you very much indeed. Now,
I
Minister,
would-
you were reacting.
I think that when you look at the numbers, in fact, when you see the high school results coming out, just to kind of slightly differ from the observations that you've made, the number of women going into technology institutions is actually very less. And far less when it comes to coding, far less when it comes to owning patents of innovations, and far lesser when it comes to commercialization of innovation. I think that when you look at scientific community, gender-based evaluation of the same, women feel that it is easy to get entry-level positions, but when it comes to promotions at the evaluation desk, that is where a lot of these minimal yet life-changing biases seep in. I also feel that wherever you have an increase in commercial capacities of a venture, you will find that women get limited in those administrative positions. And the fatter the check, the larger the man sitting there. So it is also now, research has proven that this is not fundamentally only a function of companies, only a function that you see in governments or educational institutions. In fact, even in non-governmental organizations and NGOs, one has found that whenever the capacity of an NGO to spend increases, more and more positions then, where money can be spent, those decisions are taken more and more by men. So I think that, yes, we are now in a point of our history sitting at the table. But do we get to take the decisive decisions at that table? That is the question. Are we getting an opportunity to lead, just not be satisfied with those entry-level positions? Because yes, there is a huge focus on political leadership, but I think the life of everyday woman in terms of leadership in academic institutions, do we have women leading there? And I think that's where the challenge still exists. Because if you're looking at feeding the pipeline in terms of leadership, one of the first examples that you find of a female leader is either in your school or your college or your university. So are we giving them those leadership examples at either the academic institutions or, for that matter, the lowest rung of administration? Are we seeing them not only at entry-level jobs, but leading a group of administrators locally? And I think that when we look at the data currently, the challenge still exists.
Thank you. Can I turn to former Prime Minister Helen Clark? You also headed up UNDP, the UN Development Programme, where I understand you sort of created parity within that organisation. How did you approach that, and what did you find as a result?
Well, when I was heading UNDP, it was in the time of Ban Ki-moon as Secretary General. And Ban Ki-moon was very insistent that he would not consider any recommendations for senior positions in the UN organizations until he was absolutely assured that there were women on shortlists and women who came through among the names recommended. And that really set a tone, an expectation that women would get a fair shake in selection processes. At UNDP, we obviously ran that right through the system. We required, of course, that women were on the long listing panels, that they were long listed, that they were on the shortlisting panels, they were shortlisted, that they were on the interview panels, that women were interviewed. You know, you just have to be very rigorous about that to ensure that women do get considered. But can I also bring in a perspective here about the critical importance of the UN and its ability to be effective for women? Because if you go back and look at the volumes that have been written about where the UN has made the most significant contributions, one of them is in setting the normative basis for gender equality. The Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, of course, the original reference in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, the establishment of the Commission on the Status of Women, of UN Women itself, that the list is long. But when the UN is under serious attack, as it is at the moment, then women's interests also end up being on the front line. And it's a matter of great concern to me now that we see the gains we've made quite fragile. I mean, in the United States itself, for example, very critical gains like Roe versus Wade, the critical constitutional right to abortion is very much under threat. But then the champions of putting it under threat then take that into the international institutions and make life extremely difficult. So my colleagues running the UN Population Fund, of course, lost all their funding from the US administration. Esther, who used to be on our desk for UNDP, UNFPA and others, tremendously generous to us all, but that stopped for UNFPA, which does such critical work with women and girls and sexual and reproductive health around the world. And we're now in a situation where we have had last year this critical anniversary of Cairo Plus 25. Cairo, the International Conference on Population and Development, which set the agenda in sexual and reproductive health and rights for the last 25 years. This year it's Beijing Plus 25. Beijing World Conference on Women really set a new high water mark. Now, isn't it interesting that the UN has not been able to organise formal intergovernmental conferences to celebrate these incredible anniversaries because of the fear of rollback, because you cannot now break new ground on these rights, and you are actually struggling to hold the lines that were reached 25 years ago. And yet we really need these declarations of 25 years ago renewed, refreshed for the challenges of today. So that really is a concern. Also, referring back to Esther's very strong interests in Security Council Resolution 1325, I understand there was an attempt to refresh resolutions on this just in the past year, and there were efforts to put in language around the importance of sexual and reproductive health services for women in conflict zones, absolutely critical, and this couldn't be got into the resolution. So the point I'm making is we've made a lot of gains, but they're fragile. The UN's under attack. The people who are putting it under attack are also not sympathetic to the women's rights agenda. And I think for women to see the importance of an effective UN as a guarantor of upholding these important norms and standards and declarations and rights that we've established is very, very important. A weak UN is not good for women.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to turn to Secretary General Baroness Scotland as well, and I know you have to peel away quite soon. From the Commonwealth perspective, I know you've done an awful lot on domestic violence. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and just why it's just so important from a moral but also an economic and social development perspective?
Well, also I'd like to say that for the Commonwealth, it was of critical importance that the 53 leaders of the Commonwealth made a total commitment to women's equality and gender mainstreaming, so that everything that we're doing in the Secretariat is focused on making sure that we deliver, not just talk about parity of treatment. And this is of fundamental importance. Just to touch a word about what I said at the beginning, that the reality for many of the women of my generation was that there were no women before us. So most of us were the first and the only, and we were the self-starters. So we made it on our own. We didn't like it. And the young women coming forward don't like it either. So this gender mainstreaming, making sure that it's in every policy, every program, that we look at the economic impact on women of every strategy that we take so that we can make exponential improvement and make sure that the gains that we have delivered over the last 25 years are not lost. Because I share with Helen the anxiety about the fact that the things that we thought were given because of the struggles that have been made by our generation, it is heartbreaking to see young women today having to make the same struggles. So in the Commonwealth, there's also an opportunity for us to look at regional variations. So for example, in the Caribbean, 11 out of the 13 Caribbean countries have the majority of permanent secretaries are women. Now, that's not the case in Asia, and it's not necessarily the case in Africa. So drilling down regionally to understand why is this happening in one region and not another, how can we create an implementation toolkit which distills that good practice? Because if in one common law Commonwealth country it is possible, then a fortiori it must be possible for us to do it in our other countries. And domestic violence was a huge issue, because if we're looking at what disables and undermines women's performance, domestic violence is one of them. It affects 1 in 3 women in the world. It's the greatest cause of morbidity in women and girls, and it has a huge economic cost. So when I was the minister in the United Kingdom dealing with this matter, it was clear that it was affecting, at that stage, 1 in 4 women, but it was costing us more than 23 billion in economic cost. And as a result of the work we did, we were able to reduce domestic violence by 64%, but we were also able to reduce the cost of domestic violence by 2.7 billion. So what I now want to do as the Secretary General of the Commonwealth is I want to introduce an implementation toolkit for all our Commonwealth countries so that we can drive down this pernicious abuse, which is actually disabling women, whether they're rich, whether they're poor, whether they're educated, uneducated, and it's a real imperative for us. If we want freedom, if we want our women to make the real contribution they can make to our economy, it is one of the real issues that we have to tackle and not run away from. So I'm really proud of what the Commonwealth is doing. I'm proud of what India is doing to address this issue. But we also know that one of the greatest opportunities to give women autonomy is to put money, economic wealth, into their hands. And if I may say so, I'd really like to congratulate the Indian government for what they've done for mobile banking, because those who've taken most advantage of these new opportunities, digitalization, has been women and young people. And with a Commonwealth with 60% of our Commonwealth is under the age of 30. And if we are going to take advantage of that demographic, we have to make sure that women and young people get a fair shake of the tree. And if we fail that, we actually failed our world. If we look at the Paris Agenda, I was just thinking about SDGs, because this is what obsesses me as Secretary General, and the delivery of those SDGs. Every single one of them, women are more disadvantaged. If we look at the poor, who are the poor? Disproportionately, they are female. Who are those on SDG 16 who don't get justiciable rights? They are women. Who are the least educated? They are women. Who suffer more in terms of health deprivation? They are women. So what does that say to us? If we actually address the issue of female disadvantage, we will successfully address the issue of SDGs. So that is fundamentally important, and we need women to stand up for other women and make that possible. And I agree with Madeleine Albright, there is a special place in hell. But I also, I'm afraid, will say to the Minister, it is fundamentally important that we take our men with us. We cannot do this on our own. I believe in 50-50. 50% women, but 50% men. And we need to be each other's champion. I will champion any man who champions a woman.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I'm very conscious, because there's a very large clock there, and I still want to leave time for questions. But before I go to the audience, Lieutenant Governor, would you like to say a few words on this topic as well?
Sure. So just under the general sort of theme of intervention, in the state of California, we're moving toward gender parity. We're not there yet, but we have half of our statewide officials are women. 30% of our legislature is women. Are women, and you're starting to see policy changing as a result of this representation. One big bill that was signed last year and went into effect 2 weeks ago is that publicly held companies with headquarters in California had to have at least one female board member, and then it ratchets up over time. So there are 600 publicly held companies in the state of California. And it's generated quite a bit of conversation about whether or not this is a good thing. In fact, there's been pushback. There have been several lawsuits. Some companies say, oh, it's too difficult to be in California. We don't want to do it. And what's been really helpful is to have data and research behind this to show, to the Secretary General's point, that this isn't just good for women. This isn't just women are complaining they want a seat at the table. This isn't just women's rights. This isn't just men saying, oh, I have daughters, I want them to have opportunity. No, it goes way beyond that, because what research is showing, and in particular some research that's being done at UC Berkeley, is that when women are involved in any organization, outcomes change. It's better for the organization, it's better for the women, it's also better for the men. And so in particular, one study that researchers at Berkeley have been working on is looking at the Morgan Stanley Index of ESG, the Environmental, Social, and Governance Index rankings, and taking companies, taking apart those how they're doing in these goals, and then looking at the profile of women working in those companies. And what they're finding is a clear correlation that the companies that have women integrated at all levels, including on boards, are frankly doing better in meeting those goals. So it's not just things like healthcare, it's not just things like companies doing right by the environment. It's also governance, transparency, and accounting, things that often can be kind of put under the rug and not necessarily focused on as much as they should be, that when there are women at the table, as it turns out, everybody, I guess, just sort of sits up a little straighter and does a better job at ensuring that that the numbers are adding up and that the problems are getting rooted out early and addressed. So I think we are moving towards a place, and I think it's a good place, where this isn't just about a woman's movement for equality and leadership. This is about a recognition that men and women working together with respect brings out the best in everybody. And I think that is the kind of vision that people can really rally behind, particularly in the face of what we're talking about, which is a century of the alpha male, which, by the way, we've just had one bad decade. I'm not ready to condemn the entire century yet.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, I'm now going to turn to the audience. I think we have some young fellows sitting over there. So would you like to ask your question? We'll take 2 or 3 and then I'll invite the panel to respond. Thank you.
Hello, thanks for the hugely inspirational panel. I've noticed that women are often asked how they balance their work responsibilities with being a mother. However, this is rarely asked in the opposite way. and that in reality, unpaid work really does fall to women generally. And if women decide to have children, that prohibitive childcare costs are a barrier in getting back into the workforce. So I'm interested in the panel's observations and assessments on what can be done about this, including maybe more generous paid parental leave to incentivise more men to stay at home. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, we have.
Hi, my name is Utkarsh, and I'm really interested in the idea of mentorship and sponsorship. If you look at the data, it turns out that women, on average, today have access to roughly equal, sometimes some data says more mentors than men. But where women are lacking, data suggests, is in access to sponsors, people who have a seat at the table and can advocate for their career advancement. So all of you are inordinately successful in what you do. I'd love to hear, how do we really scale sponsorship? How do we democratize sponsorship?
Great, thank you very much indeed. And our third question from our young fellow.
We were actually curious that in the current scenario of the ironic backlash that we received with the Me Too campaign, since you were the outlier women, what would you suggest for young women who are trying to enter the political arena as some of the measures we can take to circumvent the backlash that we've received?
Great, thank you very much indeed. So a question on balancing work and family life, financial burdens, unpaid work, a question on how to scale up sponsorship, and a particular question around post-Me Too and the impact that has. Dr. Brimmer.
First, thank you for the questions. I'll take up the two on parental leave and on mentors, but I know others may want to take. So just on parental leave, I mean, first, this goes that the whole argument about parental leave, which started with maternity leave, actually helped both men and women. And so what we are seeing is that more employers are making choices, recognizing that in order to retain talented staff, they need to offer parental leave. And I will stress parental leave, that yes, while women still bear the vast majority of the work related to doing home and work, I do want to acknowledge the emergence, particularly in this next generation. And I'll say I personally had not one, but two young men who worked for me at the State Department who said, how can I work out parental leave in my demanding schedule? And we worked on that. And I'll say now that amongst the, I run a non-governmental organization in Washington, D.C. now. The city of Washington, this goes back to political leaders, has just passed a new paid parental leave program. Our association did that, we already had it, because that's part of being a progressive employer. And so I think we're seeing more women who are then able to command decisions, building into their choices these sorts of decisions, because it's all about supporting talent. But it's a long way to go, because that it's not required in enough places. But that's part of changing the environment. And then on mentors, I will say that exactly, it's interesting, of course, seeing the young fellows here, that I've noticed that one thing that I'll say is, first, yes, we've benefited greatly from mentors. I know I personally benefited greatly from Secretary Albright, and how she really does, she walks the walk about actually supporting women in their careers. But I'll notice that I'm increasingly seeing a variety of professionals in professional settings, professional associations that are making conscious efforts to include young fellows, young professionals, and setting up mentor programs so that, because indeed often the question is where you start, and I'm seeing that professional associations can play a role as saying part of being a professional in your field, whatever your field is also looking out for the next generation. That includes men and women.
Thank you very much.
Well, perhaps picking up first the last question around backlash with Me Too. I mean, yes, there's backlash, but there's also backlash against backlash. And I think women have to be strong. They have to form alliances to keep trying to push forward on issues like political representation and representation in the range of other bodies. And I think we should be inspired by what happened in the 2018 elections in the United States. I mean, that produced the most diverse, largest women's caucuses in the House of Representatives that we've ever seen. It was just so fantastic, so encouraging. So, that certainly inspires me. Now, coming back to the issue of unpaid work, globally, the figure is that women do 3/4 of the world's unpaid work, right? Men do 1/4 of it. And a lot of it is associated with family responsibilities, and not only for children, for the older relatives with illness or disability. I mean, I'm speaking as one who has a father who's about to turn 98. I have 3 sisters. We cluck and fuss around my dad, but we do it willingly. I sometimes think if Dad had had 4 sons and not 4 daughters, would it be the same? I don't think so somehow. But also, you still see gender-based criticism of women in high positions who have small children. And I'll give a New Zealand example. I mean, we have a young woman Prime Minister who is considered inspirational and is inspirational in so many ways in the leadership that she's given. But one of the tags, the hashtags which was attached to her after she had a baby was part-time PM. And it was attached to her by a leader of the opposition who is male, who has 3 young children. And no one attached a hashtag of part-time leader of the opposition, because the assumption was there was a woman somewhere looking after his children. So women are still fighting these battles of perception that if they have a child, it's going to impact on their ability to do the job. If I think back to the last election campaign in New Zealand, before our Prime Minister knew she was pregnant and going to have a baby, the question was put to her by some interviewers, well, if you become Prime Minister, are you likely to have to take time off work to have a baby? And, well, the answer is obviously none of your business. But no one asks a man politician that if you're in public office and there's a new baby, are you going to take time off? And really, it's so unfair. I often cited, with respect to this, the example of David Cameron, who took paid parental leave. He took time to be with a new baby. I think that's fantastic. And to see those responsibilities shared, I think, is so critical to gender equality.
And surely it's about time of shifting away from workplace practices in the workplace that are seen to be for women's issues, when actually it's about general good practice in the workplace. It's about shared parental leave, something the UK has introduced, where men and women, or both partners, can take up to 52 weeks off to share that. And one of the most powerful images I have in my sort of career history is when I was working in sort of national security, counter-terrorism, very reactive, very responsive, working to a director whose wife also worked. They had children. One of them was in the creche, and at 6 o'clock, because that's when the creche shut, he would leave the office with a briefcase of papers in one hand and a small child tucked under his other arm. And he resumed in the evening, but nobody queried it. And we have several examples, and it is not a woman's issue. It is a workplace practice to be able to put in place these things, and only then can we shift away. Anyway, I've abused my position yet again. Minister,
I think that the lady who's talking about the backlash for the Me Too movement, while Ms. Clark speaks about an alliance of women across the world holding up this cause, even if you're that one single voice, speak on. Because you speak for those who might not have still the courage to speak. You stand for those who might not still have representation to speak on. For sexual harassment cannot be a work ethic for any company, for any organization. As Minister, as Joanna rightfully said, we have in the past 3 years established one-stop crisis centers, 623 number across the country. And one of the facilitations given to women at the district and the grassroots level is that they can approach a counselor, or if they feel that they cannot report it in their organization or at a police station, they can get that legal, medical and counsel help and police help at that particular center. And I should say here that in the past 3 years, we've had 240,000 women walking up to the center and getting help. Women to the tune of over 3 million calling up and getting help through helplines. So if they don't speak in public, they are still speaking on platforms where they hope to get justice. Insofar as paid leave, I think that there is a cultural context to it as well. Like Ms. Clark said, never, ever is a male politician or a male panel asked who looks after your babies. But quintessentially, everywhere there is a panel of females, that is the one question that always gets posed, irrespective of the nationality of that female leader. And I think that tells us that this is not an area which is specific for conversation or deliberation as per cultural, I think, lineages that we have, which is maybe an Asian issue or a European issue. This is an international issue where everywhere today, even if you give the example of a man walking away with a briefcase and a child in the other hand, there are still many such biases which are very inherent. We have now in my country 26 weeks of paid leave, and that legislation was brought to force by a male prime minister. And we've had a female prime minister before. So I think that when it comes to unpaid work, when it comes to paid leave, these are issues which go beyond gender, and when it is looked upon from a legislation perspective, and also I think from an economic perspective, it makes a lot of I think it makes a lot of sense for economies which are hoping to be more inclusive, which are hoping to be strong, because it is essential to have women as the center of economies that hope to surge. And insofar as the sponsorship and mentorship issue that Utkarsh has highlighted, I can only speak from an Indian perspective. The numbers of mentors at the grassroots are still a challenge. Sponsors are still lesser. So I think that we need to have more and more mentors at the local level, because today, yes, mentorship is an agenda for many an organization at the national level, but I think that grassroots need to be strengthened from a mentorship point of view.
Thank you. We are rapidly running out of time, and I feel we're just beginning to scratch the surface. Lieutenant Governor, quick response to the questions, and then I'll ask you one final question to wrap up the session.
Well, let me just acknowledge that these are really important questions, because there are still grave inequalities that exist. We're still not doing as much as we need to in terms of women sponsoring other women. I think that's a really valid point. But I guess because I'm not a sociologist, but people look to me in my role for answers, that I really do go back to the data and rely on the data. And what we see is a growing body of research and a growing body of evidence that when women are incorporated into all levels of leadership in any kind of organization, the organization does better and everyone does better. And when we can use that information as a tool to generate consensus by men and women that gender parity is something that will help everyone, I think that it helps us make progress in some of these things that are still very elusive.
Thank you very much indeed. Just before we conclude, we've touched on some really big issues here. We've talked about political leadership, we've talked about decision making, we've talked about role models, how we can support each other, men, women, working together to the benefit of all. But some pretty serious challenges still afoot. The rollback that Prime Minister Clark talked about, the challenge of sort of strongman masculinity sort of politics. So a final question to the panel as we close, and I'll start from that end. Ultimately optimistic?
Always. I live in California. The sun never stops shining, and all things are possible.
Thank you. Dr. Brimmer?
I remain optimistic, because over the course of history, there have been many setbacks and many challenges. But yes, I do think that the arc of history bends towards justice.
Thank you.
I'm optimistic because I'm from New Zealand and we've shown we can do it.
Well, I'm an Indian, we're eternally optimistic. But I will only say this, in India we believe that if you want to go to the right destination, then you need to ensure that there is a woman leading the pack. So in our families even today, we ensure that while, yes, economically, and we are seeing these conversations being held across families, that there was a time, yes, that in major decisions in families, you would see the woman taking a back seat, but today they are equal partners. And I think that's where the resolution lies, that we're hoping to bring about a political change, an economic change. The change has to begin from our families.
And just to complete it, a full house, I'm ultimately optimistic. So I think by working together, and everybody in this room can start by making a change today. May I just thank the members of the fantastic panel, the great conversation that we've had today. Prime Minister Clark, Dr. Brimmer, Lieutenant Governor and Baroness Scotland. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to you.